The fluorescent lights in room 412 of Hargrove Medical Center never fully dimmed. They buzzed with a relentless, sickly hum 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, as if the hospital itself refused to acknowledge the existence of night. That sound had become the soundtrack of Diane Dawson's life for the past 11 months. It lived inside her skull, now vibrating behind her eyes, following her into the shallow, broken sleep she managed in the hard plastic chair beside her son's bed. She had stopped noticing it the way people stop noticing the sound of a highway near their house, not because it became pleasant, but because the mind eventually surrenders to what it cannot change. Eli Dawson was 16 years old. He weighed 74 pounds. The disease had a name: osteosarcoma, a brutal, fast-moving bone cancer that had announced itself 14 months ago as a dull ache in Eli's right leg during basketball practice at Garfield High School. His coach had told him to walk it off. The team physician had suggested a mild strain. By the time the correct diagnosis arrived, the tumor had already consumed the lower third of his femur, eating through the bone with the patient indifferent efficiency of something that does not need to hurry because it has already won. The amputation of his right leg below the knee had followed 6 weeks later, performed in the same hospital, in a surgical suite 3 floors below where he now lay dying. The surgery had not saved him. It had only bought time, and time, as it turned out, had never been on Eli Dawson's side. The cancer had moved into his lungs 8 months ago, then his lymph nodes, then quietly and without permission into everything else. It moved the way a fire moves through a dry structure, finding the paths of least resistance, consuming what it found, leaving behind something changed in its fundamental nature. The doctors had used words like aggressive and advanced, and then eventually the word that ends all other conversations: terminal. They had said it in different rooms on different days, and each time it had the same weight, the same finality, the same quality of a door being locked from the outside. Diane had fought every battle a mother could fight. She had driven 400 miles to Seattle for a second opinion, then a third, sitting in waiting rooms with her hands folded in her lap and her face composed into the expression of a woman who is not going to fall apart in a public place. She had submitted applications to 3 experimental treatment programs on the West Coast, filling out the forms with the obsessive thoroughness of someone who believes that if the paperwork is perfect enough, the outcome will follow. She had sat on hold with insurance companies for hours that stretched into days, pressing the phone hard against her ear, as if physical force could accelerate the process, filling out forms in waiting rooms, while her hands shook and her coffee went cold beside her on the plastic chair. She had called numbers she found online at 2 in the morning, her laptop screen the only light in the apartment, spoken to researchers at universities in California and Oregon who were kind and specific and ultimately unable to help, begged a clinical trial coordinator in Portland to reconsider Eli's eligibility, explaining the situation in the careful, precise language of a woman who has rehearsed the argument so many times she can deliver it without crying. None of it had worked. The disease moved faster than hope. It always had. Dr. Owen Pratt had pulled her into the hallway just after 6 that morning. He was a tall, quietly spoken man in his mid-50s, a pediatric oncologist who had spent 20 years delivering the worst possible news to the best possible people, and it had carved something permanent and sorrowful into his face, a kind of weathering that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with accumulated witness. He wore it the way certain men wear old injuries, not with self-pity, but with the matter-of-fact acknowledgement of someone who has made peace with what their life has required of them. He had chosen his words carefully, the way a man handles something fragile, turning each one over before setting it down. Organ failure has begun, Diane. We are talking about hours, possibly a day. The morphine drip will keep him comfortable and he will not be in pain. What matters now is that he is not alone and that he is not afraid. She had nodded. She had thanked him, which she did every time he delivered bad news, a reflex of courtesy that she recognized as absurd and could not stop. She had walked back into room 412 and sat down in the plastic chair and taken her son's hand, and she had not said a word to anyone since. She had sat in the particular silence of someone who has run out of moves and is now simply present, which is both the hardest and the most important thing. Eli's hand felt like a collection of small, brittle twigs wrapped in paper. The skin over his knuckles was nearly translucent, threaded with pale blue veins that seemed to carry something thinner and more fragile than blood, as if the disease had diluted everything it touched. His head was bald, had been for 10 months, the hair lost to the chemotherapy that had ultimately failed him, and the pillow behind him was so white it seemed to generate its own light. The oxygen cannula beneath his nose hissed softly with every shallow breath, a sound that Diane had come to track unconsciously the way sailors track wind changes, listening for variations in rhythm that might signal something worse. His face, which had once been the face of a boy who played basketball and argued about baseball statistics and ate cereal straight from the box standing in front of the open refrigerator at 10 o'clock at night, was now hollowed and still, the cheeks sunken inward. The eyes ringed with deep, bruised shadows that made him look simultaneously younger and older than 16. But he was awake. He had been awake since before dawn, watching the ceiling with dark, alert eyes that missed nothing, that tracked every movement in the room with the careful attention of someone who has decided to pay close attention to everything because everything is running out. The room itself had accumulated the small archaeology of long hospitalization. Cards on the windowsill from classmates at Garfield High, their handwriting large and cheerful in the way of people who do not know what else to offer. A photograph of Eli at 13 in a basketball uniform, mid-jump the ball, leaving his hands, his face arranged in the pure, focused expression of someone who is exactly where they want to be. A small blue blanket from home folded over the foot of the mechanical bed brought by Diane in the first week, when the hospital blankets seemed insufficient, as if the familiarity of the fabric might offset the strangeness of the place. These objects had taken on the quality of relics, each one carrying a specific weight that had nothing to do with its physical mass. A knock at the door came just before 9. It was a careful knock, soft and apologetic, the knock of someone who is not sure of their welcome and is announcing themselves before entering rather than after. Amber Kosei came into the room with the careful, gentle energy of someone trained to deliver good news in bad places. She was in her late 20s with light brown hair pulled back from her face and a clipboard pressed to her chest like a document of purpose. Her smile was present and working hard. She represented the Children's Wish Foundation, the regional chapter out of Spokane, and she had been assigned to Eli's case 3 weeks ago when Dr. Pratt had first suggested in his careful and indirect way that it might be time to think about final wishes. She introduced herself to Diane with a soft handshake, her grip warm and practiced, and then turned to Eli with the full warmth of her smile directed at him, specifically the way people direct warmth at someone who needs it rather than someone who has earned it. She told him she was there to help make something happen, something memorable, something that was entirely his choice and entirely about him and had nothing to do with what anyone else thought was appropriate or reasonable. She said it the way people say things when they are trying very hard not to say the actual truth underneath the words, which was that she was there because he was going to die very soon. And this was the last thing anyone could do for him, and she wanted very much for it to mean something. She had a list. She went through it carefully, her voice modulated to the specific register of professional compassion. Each item presented as a genuine possibility rather than an item to be checked off. A private video call with the governor of Washington, she said, arranged through the foundation's government liaison program. Front row tickets to any sporting event anywhere in the country, she said, with a full medical transport team standing by and whatever accommodations were required. A virtual meeting with any musician or athlete or actor or public figure he could name the foundation. Had connections across the entertainment industry. A private acoustic performance in this room from the band she had seen on his social media, a rock group out of Portland called Westfall that he had apparently followed and streamed for 3 years. She had already made a preliminary inquiry and they were willing. Eli listened to all of it without expression. He lay against his pillow with his hands still at his sides and his eyes on Amber Koss's face, not with hostility, but with the particular patience of someone who is waiting for something to be over. He heard every word. He considered them with the seriousness they deserved. Then he turned his head on the pillow and looked at her with those exhausted, ancient eyes. The eyes of a boy who has been living at the edge of the largest question for long enough that smaller questions have lost their urgency, and he said, his voice barely louder than the hiss of the oxygen line, that he didn't want any of it. Amber's smile faltered just slightly, the practiced warmth encountering something it had not been prepared for. She asked him gently with genuine care beneath a professional manner what he did want. Eli reached beneath his pillow with one trembling hand. He moved slowly, the effort of the motion visible in the tightening of the muscles along his jaw, the slight catch in his breathing. He pulled out a small, heavy object and held it up so the morning light from the window could reach it. It was a coin, silver or something that had once been silver, now tarnished to a deep pewter gray. The surface matte and dull except where the embossed detail caught the light and threw it back. It was roughly the size of a $half thick and solid, with a worn, textured edge that spoke of years of handling. On one face, deeply embossed with the precision of something made to be permanent, was an image that Amber Kossi had certainly never seen up close before. A skull rendered in careful detail with wings spread wide behind it in full extension. The feathers individually articulated the whole image, carrying the craftsmanship of something made to last beyond its owner. Around the circumference of the coin, following the curve of the edge in capital letters, were the words, Hell's Road MC. Below the skull on a flat base, two more words pressed deep into the metal. Spokane Charter. Diane, who had been staring at her son's hand with the unfocused gaze of someone deep inside their own exhaustion, looked up when Eli raised his arm. Her eyes landed on the coin. Something moved across her face fast and complicated, a sequence of reactions that came and went before any single one could be named, like weather crossing open ground. Eli looked at Amber Koss and told her what he wanted. He wanted the Hell's Road Motorcycle Club, the Spokane Charter. He wanted them to come to this hospital. He wanted to hear their engines outside this window, and he wanted to know whether his father had been a bad man. He said all of this in the same quiet, unhurried voice, as if the requests were reasonable and the obstacles to them were not his problem to solve. The room was very quiet for a moment. The oxygen line hissed. The monitors beeped in their measured rhythm. Outside the window, the October sky over Spokane was the color of old pewter clouds, low and moving fast from the west. Amber Kossi looked at the coin. She looked at Diane. She looked back at the coin with the expression of someone who has just understood the full dimensions of a problem and is now calculating whether there is any version of this situation that ends well. The color had drained from her face in a way that had nothing to do with the fluorescent lighting. She told them both in a voice carefully held at the level of professional composure that she was so deeply and genuinely sorry. She said she wished with everything she had that the answer were different. She explained that her regional director had reviewed the initial inquiry the previous evening after Diane had first raised the possibility in a phone call, and that the foundation's corporate policy on this matter was explicit, documented, and without exception at any level of the organization. They could not sanction, organize, facilitate, or be in any way associated with contact between a wish recipient and any organization federally designated as an outlaw motorcycle club. She said the words with the careful flatness of someone reading from a document they did not write and cannot change. Eli closed his eyes. He didn't argue. He didn't express disappointment or frustration or any of the emotions that would have been entirely reasonable. He simply pressed the coin against his sternum with both hands, his thin fingers curling around it, and held it there the way you hold something you are not going to let go of. Diane looked at her son's face. The anxiety that had lived there for weeks, the quiet, corrosive terror of a boy who knows he is leaving the world with questions still burning inside him, unresolved and unanswered, was still there, unchanged by Amber Koss's visit or her list or her carefully composed expression of regret. She had known about Gary's connection to motorcycles in the way a wife knows things, Her husband never fully explains, and she never fully asks about the knowledge accumulated through peripheral evidence rather than direct conversation. Gary Merritt had been a mechanic, a genuinely gifted one, the kind of man who could diagnose an engine problem by sound alone, who kept his tools organized in the red metal chest with a precision and care he brought to almost nothing else in his life. He had done work for people she had never been introduced to, men who came to the garage after hours and paid in cash, and whose names she was not offered. She had understood enough to know she did not want to understand more. She had told him so more than once in the kitchen after Eli was in bed, her voice kept low and her words chosen carefully. Gary had listened with the expression of a man who hears the concern without accepting its conclusion, and nothing had changed. But she had never seen that coin before this morning. She reached out and took it from Eli's hands, gently working it loose from his fingers with the care of someone handling something that matters. She turned it over in her fingers. It was heavier than it looked with the density of something made from real metal and real intention. The skull stared up at her from the center of her palm, its wings spread in permanent flight. Eli opened his eyes. He looked at his mother with an expression that was not quite a request and not quite an apology, but lived in the territory between the two. The expression of a person who has been carrying something alone for a long time and is finally setting it on a table between them. He told her that he had found the coin in Gary's old toolbox 3 years ago. He had been going through the storage unit on Fletcher Road, where Diane kept the things she could not bring herself to dispose of, boxes of Gary's clothes and tools and paperwork, and the small accumulated evidence of a life that had ended when Eli was 4 years old. He said he had opened the red metal tool chest expecting to find sockets and wrenches, and instead found the coin sitting in the small tray at the top alone, as if it had been placed there deliberately rather than simply left. He said he had held it for a long time before putting it in his pocket without knowing exactly why. He had kept it ever since the object moving from drawer to jacket pocket to the small wooden box on his desk, and finally 3 weeks ago, on the night Dr. Pratt first used the word hospice, to beneath his pillow where it had been every night since. He told Diane that he barely remembered Gary. Not in the way of images, not scenes he could describe in sequence. What he had were sensations specific and physical, the kind of early memories that live in the body rather than the mind. The smell of motor oil combined with something warm and outdoor like sun-heated asphalt on a summer afternoon. A deep vibration he could feel in his chest and in the bones of his hands, a frequency that seemed to come from beneath him and move upward through everything. The sound of engines, large and multiple, and all around him, making the air itself feel thick and alive and charged with something. And a fragment that was either a genuine memory or a dream he had at some point decided to believe, of sitting on the gas tank of a motorcycle, his small hands gripping chrome, looking out at an open road, while a pair of forearms reached around him on both sides, tattooed and steady and certain. He said he needed to know if the man whose arms those were had been worth carrying. He said it quietly with the particular dignity of someone who has spent a long time finding the exact right words for something and has finally located them. The door to room 412 opened without a knock. The handle turned with the confident authority of someone who does not require permission for entry. Gloria Wexler stepped inside. She was the senior administrator of Hargrove Medical Center, a position she had held for 9 years, in which she understood primarily as a function of managing risk and protecting the institution from its own vulnerabilities. She wore a charcoal blazer over a cream blouse, and she held her clipboard with both hands in front of her, with the bearing of someone who has prepared for this conversation and intends to conduct it efficiently. She did not look at Eli when she began speaking. She addressed Diane directly, which was either a calculated choice or an instinctive one, and the result was the same regardless. She said she wanted to be clear because clarity was her responsibility when situations of this nature arose, and this situation had come to her attention through the Foundation's inquiry the previous evening. She said that the Hells Road Motorcycle Club was a federally monitored organization with a documented presence in Spokane County, that its members carried criminal histories encompassing drug distribution, extortion, weapons violations, an aggravated assault, and that under no circumstances and with no exceptions would she permit any member of that organization to enter this facility. She said the pediatric oncology ward existed to provide safe medical care to children in their most vulnerable moments, and that the staff who provided that care deserved a safe working environment. She said that if Diane succeeded in establishing contact with these individuals, and if any one of them appeared on hospital property, she would have them removed and arrested for trespassing with no hesitation and no apology to anyone. Then for the first time, she looked at Eli. Her expression shifted fractionally, the professional composure softening at the edges in the specific way it softens in people who are not without feeling, but have placed feeling secondary to function. She said she was genuinely sorry for what he was going through. Then she left, pulling the door closed behind her with a firmness that stopped just short of a slam. Eli had not looked at Gloria Wexler once during the entire exchange. He had been watching his mother's face with the close attention of someone reading a text that is still being written. Nurse Pat Doyle, who had been quietly adjusting the rate on Eli's IV drip near the window, finished what she was doing with the unhurried precision of someone who has learned not to rush the things that matter. She gathered her chart and moved toward the door. She paused beside Diane's chair and rested one hand on Diane's shoulder briefly, the gesture carrying the compressed weight of 22 years in pediatric oncology of everything she had witnessed and everything she understood about what could and could not be fixed. She did not say anything. She did not need to. She moved her hand and went to the door and paused there once more with her back to the room. She said without turning around that she would be at the nurse's station all night. Then she left. Diane sat with the coin in her palm for a long time after the room emptied of everyone except her and Eli and the machines keeping count of his remaining time. She listened to the wet, labored rhythm of his breathing, which had changed in the past week, in ways she tracked with the precision of someone who has studied a single subject exhaustively. She listened to the hum of the fluorescent lights and the beep of the monitors and the distant sound of rain beginning against the window, and she thought about Gary Merritt. Gary had died on a rain-slicked state highway 12 miles outside Spokane on a Tuesday night in October 12 years ago, when Eli was 4 years old and Diane was 30, and had not yet learned what it felt like to be entirely alone. The Highway Patrol report had described a single vehicle accident, the language neutral and procedural. High speed, poor visibility, a curve taken too fast, the inevitable result of those three factors combined. The investigating officer had noted the victim was not wearing a helmet. There had been no witnesses, no other vehicles involved, no explanation offered for what the victim had been doing on that highway at that hour in that weather. The motorcycle had been identified as a 2003 Harley-Davidson Softail, registered to a private party in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, a name Diane did not recognize. Not Gary's bike. That had registered in the numb anesthesia of those first weeks as a detail that could mean something. She had chosen not to ask what. She had understood with the self-protective clarity of acute grief that the answers available to her might be worse than the silence she was choosing instead. She had buried Gary on a Friday in the good suit he had owned since their wedding and worn perhaps 3 times since, and she had chosen the silence, and she had kept choosing it for 12 years, and she had believed if she thought about it at all that the choice was permanent. She looked at the coin, she looked at her son's face, at the anxiety in it, the unanswered question that had taken up residence there, and that she could no more evict with comfort than she could stop the cancer. She looked at the monitors and the IV stands and the oxygen cannula and the thin hospital blanket and the small blue blanket from home folded over his feet. Diane Dawson stood up. She set the coin on the bedside table where Eli could reach it and turned to get her car keys and her jacket from the hook behind the door. She turned to the doorway and found Nurse Doyle there, as if she had not moved far, as if she had expected this. Diane asked her quietly to stay with him. Doyle looked at the coin on the table. She looked at Diane's face, reading it the way she read the faces of parents in this ward, with the comprehensive understanding of someone trained in the language of people under extreme pressure. She walked to the bedside and picked up the coin and pressed it gently into Eli's hand, wrapping his fingers around it with both of hers. Then she pulled the chair closer to the bed and sat down in it with the settled quality of someone who intends to be precisely there for as long as necessary. Diane did not speak to Gloria Wexler on her way out. She did not pause at the nurse's station or look at the security camera at the end of the corridor or give any outward sign of the specific resolution that had formed in her during the last 10 minutes in room 412. She walked through the corridor, past the elevator, pushed through the fire door, and went down 4 flights of concrete stairs to the parking garage below her, boots on the steps, making the only sound in the stairwell. The rain hit her the moment she stepped out of the garage door, cold and immediate, the kind of October rain in eastern Washington that carries winter in it, that makes promises about what is coming. She sat in her 2011 Honda Accord with both hands on the wheel and the engine not yet running. The parking garage smelled of exhaust and wet concrete. The overhead fluorescent above her car flickered twice, steadied and held. She sat there for perhaps 2 minutes, which felt much longer, looking at the rain moving sideways through the cone of light at the garage entrance. Then she started the engine and drove east. The Hells Road MC Clubhouse did not appear in any online directory or business listing. It was not a place that invited or expected civilian visitors and had structured its presence in the city accordingly. But Spokane was not a large city, and the club had existed in it for 27 years, and the location was the kind of thing people in certain neighborhoods knew. The way they knew which intersections flooded in heavy rain through accumulated ambient knowledge fragments overheard and retained without intention. A mechanic named Walt at the shop on 2nd Avenue, where Gary had briefly worked in 2007, had mentioned it once in Diane's presence, naming the street and the general area with the casual specificity of someone citing a landmark. She had not written it down. She had not needed to. She drove through streets she did not know well. Streets that occupied the eastern industrial margins of the city where the zoning had never quite resolved itself into anything coherent. Blocks where warehouses and auto salvage yards and concrete plants existed in an ungoverned adjacency. The rain hammered the roof of the Accord. The wipers moved in their steady arc. The street lights here were tall sodium lamps that threw orange pools onto the wet pavement and left the spaces between them fully dark. She passed a chain-link fence topped with coiled wire, a shuttered transmission shop, a row of storage units sealed with heavy padlocks the size of fists, a gravel yard full of construction equipment sitting in the rain like sleeping animals. Then she found Haverty Road. The warehouse sat at the end of a long gravel lot behind a 10-foot chain-link fence, reinforced with steel posts sunk deep into concrete footings, the kind of installation that communicates intent rather than simply establishing a boundary. The building itself was enormous, the size of an aircraft hangar, painted matte black from the poured concrete foundation all the way to the roofline, without a single window on the street-facing wall. Under a corrugated tin awning along the south side, a row of motorcycles stood in a line with the orderly, deliberate precision of soldiers at dress inspection. Custom Harley-Davidsons, every one of them, their chrome surfaces catching the ambient light from a distant security lamp and throwing it back in cold points of reflection. They gleamed even in the rain. Each one obviously and obsessively maintained the machines of men for whom the machines are not transportation but expression. Above the reinforced steel door mounted on the black exterior wall, a sign. Red letters on black background, large enough to read from the street without effort. Hells Road MC Spokane Charter. Diane sat in the idling car with both hands still on the wheel and looked at the sign through the rain-streaked windshield. She was trembling. She recognized this fact about herself without judgment, because judgment required a portion of her attention that she needed for other things. She was a 42-year-old woman alone in a dark parking lot outside the fortified compound of an outlaw motorcycle club in the industrial district of East Spokane at 9:30 on a rainy October morning. The fear was appropriate, and she had no intention of listening to it. She got out of the car. The gravel shifted and crunched under her boots. The rain hit her immediately, and without mercy, soaking through the shoulders of her jacket in seconds. She walked toward the gate with the straight-line purposefulness of someone who knows that slowing down will make the fear louder. The heavy steel door of the warehouse opened before she reached the fence. A man came out into the rain. He was enormous in the way that reads as a fact about the world rather than a fact about a person, broad through the chest and shoulders, with arms that began where most men's arms ended, covered from wrist to rolled sleeve in dense dark tattoo work accumulated over decades. His leather cut was black and worn to a supple softness that comes only from years of use, and the patch on his left chest identified his role in white embroidered thread. Sergeant at Arms. Below it, his road name, Slab. Wade Tanner crossed his arms over his chest and looked at her with the expression of a man who has encountered unexpected things on his property before and has learned to evaluate them before reacting to any of them. He told her she was lost. He said the hospital was 4 miles west. He told her to turn around and go back the way she came. Diane reached into her jacket pocket. Her fingers found the coin, the one Eli had pressed into her hand when she kissed his forehead, before leaving his eyes asking the question his lungs were too depleted to voice at volume. She held it up between them. The rain ran over her fingers and over the embossed skull with its spread wings and the raised letters of the charter name. Slab's eyes dropped from her face to the coin. Something changed in him, a shift in the quality of his attention, the evaluation stopping, and something older and more complicated beginning in its place. He looked at the coin for a long moment, the rain falling on both of them without preference. She told him her name. She told him that Gary Merritt had been her husband. She told him her son was 16 years old and dying in a hospital 4 miles west, and that he had 12 years of questions and perhaps 30 hours remaining to find the answers to them. Slab looked at the coin for a few seconds more. Then he reached to his belt, found the key, and unlocked the gate. He pushed it open and walked her across the gravel toward the black door without touching her, and without saying anything else, the silence of a man who has made a decision and is implementing it. The interior of the warehouse arrived as a sensory event rather than a space. The smell came first, the layered, worked-in smell of stale beer and motor oil, and decades of cigarette smoke that had become part of the chemical composition of the wood itself, inseparable from the building. Classic rock played from a jukebox in the far corner, something from the 70s, guitar-driven and loud, the kind of music that fills the chest as much as the ears. 2 pool tables occupied the middle ground toward the back wall, cues and motion games in progress. Men sat at a long bar on the left, bottles in their hands or on the scarred surface in front of them. More men sat in heavy wooden chairs arranged around a massive oak table at the center of the room, the table itself carrying the marks of long-use rings from glasses, gouges from unknown incidents, the accumulated record of a piece of furniture that has been at the center of significant events. When Slab walked Diane through the door, the jukebox might as well have lost its power. The pool cues stopped mid-motion. The men at the bar set down their bottles without looking to see where they were setting them. Every pair of eyes in the room moved to her, and the silence that fell was not simply the absence of sound, but the presence of held breath, the stillness of a room that has suspended itself and is waiting to understand what it is waiting for. Seated at the head of the oak table, occupying the chair at its far end, with the settled authority of a man who has never once doubted his right to be at the center of whatever room he is in, was Raymond Calhoun. He was in his late 50s, broad and heavy through the chest and shoulders, in a way that came from a lifetime of physical existence rather than deliberate cultivation. His beard was gray trim close on the jaw and somewhat longer on the chin. His face held the record of a life conducted at the outer edges of things, 2 scars on his jaw and one that cut through his left eyebrow and disrupted its line, giving his face an asymmetry that communicated something about history rather than accident. His eyes were a pale, almost colorless blue that moved to Diane the moment she came through the door and stayed there with the complete, unhurried attention of a man who has learned that most things worth knowing about a situation are visible before anyone speaks. He did not stand. He looked at Slab. Slab crossed the room with the deliberate economy of a large man who does not waste motion, reached the oak table and placed the coin on its surface in front of Calhoun. The coin clattered once spun on its edge and came to rest with the skull facing upward. Calhoun looked down at it. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. The men around the table shifted with the barely perceptible collective movement of people who have read the atmosphere and adjusted their posture in response to it. Nobody spoke. Calhoun's pale eyes came up slowly to Diane's face. He asked her where she had gotten it. His voice was low and carried the kind of gravel that accumulates in a voice over decades of use, in loud environments and outdoor air, not performed but simply the result of the life that had produced it. Diane told him everything. She told him about the storage unit on Fletcher Road and the red metal toolbox, and Eli finding the coin when he was 13 and keeping it in secret for 3 years. She told him about the osteosarcoma and the amputation and the 14 months of fighting the disease through every available avenue. She told him about Dr. Pratt's words in the hallway that morning, about the 74 pounds, about the morphine drip. She told him about Amber Cossey and the Children's Wish Foundation and their policy and the list of things her dying son had refused without consideration. Then she told him what Eli wanted. The room absorbed this in silence. Nobody moved. The fire in the iron stove against the far wall shifted and settled with a small sound that was loud in the quiet. Calhoun reached out and picked up the coin. He rolled it between his thumb and forefinger with the automatic familiarity of someone who has handled this specific object before, or others exactly like it, the tarnished surface moving in and out of the light thrown by the overhead fixtures. He looked at it for a long time with an expression that did not change, but that contained something behind its stillness that Diane could not read. Then he looked at her with those pale, emptied eyes, and he told her about Gary Merritt. He did not soften it or find gradual approaches to it, or give her any warning beyond the slight pause before he began. He said Gary had been a prospect, a man in the process of earning full membership assigned to the club's garage operation on Industrial Way, where he ran mechanical work and managed the day-to-day financial receipts. He said Gary had been genuinely talented with engines, the kind of intuitive mechanical ability that cannot be taught because it is not a learned skill, but something closer to a native language. He said the club had believed in Gary the way organizations believe in people who have demonstrated real value. He said that Gary had also been systematically stealing from the garage receipts for approximately 14 months, skimming cash in amounts calculated to be below the threshold of immediate notice before the discrepancy grew large enough and consistent enough that suspicion became certainty. He said when the club made clear that they knew Gary had walked into the garage on a Tuesday night, taken a club-owned motorcycle without authorization, and driven it east out of Spokane into a storm the Weather Service had flagged as severe. He said the coin on the table was what the club called a debt marker. It meant Gary Merritt had left this world in a condition of outstanding obligation. He set the coin back on the table between them. He said he was sorry about the boy. He said it the way certain men express sympathy briefly and without decoration, as if the fewer words used, the more genuine the ones that remain. Then he looked at Slab and said 2 words: escort her. Diane heard her own voice before she had fully made the decision to use it. She said, please. The word came out alone, and then she was on her knees on the concrete floor of the Hells Road MC Clubhouse, and she was not entirely certain of the sequence of movements that had produced this position. The floor was cold and hard and smelled of oil and spilled beer and the long history of the building. She told Calhoun she was not asking him to forgive Gary Merritt. She told him she was not asking the club to absorb an old debt or pretend a wrong had not been done. She said she was asking for a few minutes in the sound of engines for a 16-year-old boy who had never done anything to anyone who weighed less than the questions he was carrying, who had used his dying wish not for entertainment or celebrity, but for truth. She said her son was not Gary. She said Eli had never taken anything from anyone. She said he had perhaps one day left in the world, and he was spending it afraid of his own blood, afraid of what he came from, afraid of what it meant that the only physical evidence of his father's existence was a debt marker belonging to an outlaw club. Calhoun looked down at her from the head of the oak table. The room was very still around them. His pale eyes held hers, and what they held in them was difficult to name with precision. It was not cruelty. It was not quite mercy. It was something that had not yet decided what it was. Then he said it again, quieter this time, with the specific finality of a decision that has been made and communicated and is not subject to revision. Get her out. Slab's hands found her arms and lifted her with the impersonal efficiency of someone performing a necessary physical task, not roughly, but completely. He walked her back through the heavy door and across the wet gravel and released her at the fence line near the gate. He locked it behind her without meeting her eyes. The walk back to the Accord was 12 steps. She counted them because counting was something her mind could do when everything else in it was going silent. She sat in the driver's seat with the door closed and the engine off, and the rain on the roof, and both hands pressed flat against the dashboard, and she breathed. She breathed with the deliberate, conscious attention of someone using it as the only available tool. She breathed for a long time. Then she started the car and drove west through the dark, wet streets of East Spokane, retracing the route she had driven an hour ago with an entirely different set of expectations. The drive back took 19 minutes. She spent them not thinking, which is a different condition from being calm, and she arrived at Hargrove Medical Center with her jacket soaked through and her hair flat against her face, and her hands somehow steadier than they had any right to be. She took the stairs, 4 flights of concrete, her boots loud in the stairwell. She pushed through the fire door onto the oncology ward and walked the corridor to room 412. Nurse Doyle was in the chair beside Eli's bed, exactly where she had been when Diane left her posture, unchanged, her attention on the boy in the bed and the numbers on the monitors. She looked up when Diane came through the door and read her face in a single long glance, and her expression confirmed that she had already understood what the answer was going to be before Diane went to find it. Eli was awake. The morphine moved through him in its heavy tide, softening the angles of the room and slowing the light, but his eyes were open, and they found his mother the moment she appeared in the doorway, tracking to her with the focused attention he had been managing since before dawn. His hand was still closed around the coin. He looked at her. The question was already present on his face before he found the breath to form it. Diane crossed the room and sat in the plastic chair and took his hand in both of hers, the coin pressing between their palms, the skull and its wings hidden in the closed space between their hands. She looked at her son, 16 years old, 74 pounds, the boy who had found a stranger's coin in a dead man's toolbox and spent 3 years carrying the weight of it alone, waiting for the moment when asking would not cost too much. She told him the most painful lies she had ever spoken. She said they were trying. She said they were working on it. She told him to rest. Eli closed his eyes. Something moved across his face, the ghost of an expression that lived between relief and resignation, the look of a person who is very tired and has decided for now to extend trust to the person holding his hand, even in the absence of certainty. Dr. Pratt appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, with the quiet materialization of someone who has been nearby and waiting. He checked the monitors, adjusted the morphine drip with the small, careful movements of long practice, and looked at the numbers with his face arranged in its professional composure. When he caught Diane's eye, he gave her the small, sorrowful nod she had come to understand over the past weeks as his way of confirming without words what both of them already knew. Outside the window, the October sky over Spokane had gone fully dark with the early darkness of the season. The rain continued its patient, indifferent work against the glass. The city lights below scattered through the water on the window into pale, wavering impressions of themselves. Inside room 412, the monitors counted. The oxygen line hissed. The fluorescent lights hummed their relentless hum. And Eli Dawson lay in the mechanical bed with a tarnished silver coin in his closed fist and his mother's hands around both of his, and neither of them slept, and neither of them spoke, and the night began its slow accumulation around them, like water rising in a room with no exits. The warehouse was quiet in a way it was rarely quiet. The jukebox had gone silent sometime in the minutes after Slab walked Diane Dawson back through the gate and locked it behind her. Nobody had restarted it. The pool cues had been set down across the table felt. The beer bottles had been abandoned on the bar, a number of them still containing beer, which was the kind of thing that did not happen in this room, and that the younger members registered without quite understanding why they were registering it, only that the atmosphere in the room had taken on a quality that made drinking seem like the wrong response to the moment. Raymond Calhoun was still at the head of the oak table. The coin was on the surface in front of him. Nobody in the room had moved to do anything about either of those facts, because both of them communicated something that did not require explanation. Calhoun sat with his forearms on the table and his eyes on the coin, and was not looking at it the way a man looks at an object. He was looking at it the way a man looks at something that connects to other things, a starting point for a chain of associations that he is working through in a particular order and taking his time with. The skull with its spread wings caught the light from the overhead fixture and returned it in dull flashes as the air movement from the stove made the light shift fractionally. The coin had been issued by this chapter. It had traveled through a specific sequence of hands to reach this table tonight. Calhoun understood every step of that sequence and what each step had meant at the time. Slab came back in from the rain, shook the water from his cut, and returned to his position at Calhoun's right without a word. He looked at the coin once and then fixed his eyes on a point in the middle distance, the posture of a man who has formed an opinion and is holding it in reserve. The iron stove against the far wall had been loaded before the rain started and was burning well now, the orange light from its vented door moving across the low ceiling and the worn wooden walls and the rows of framed photographs that had accumulated there over 2 decades. Charter history in those frames, runs to Sturgis and Daytona, group photographs from rallies and states across the region, individual portraits, formal and informal, faces that had aged in the pictures the way faces age when compared across years, and faces that had not aged because they were no longer here to age. Calhoun's eyes moved from the coin to the wall. He found the photograph he was looking for without searching. He knew exactly where it was because he had put it there himself and had not moved it since, though he had stopped looking at it directly some years ago. It was in the third frame from the left on the middle row, between a 2004 rally photograph and a group shot from a Sturgis run. Smaller than the others, printed from a disposable camera on the thin paper of a drugstore print, framed because someone in the chapter at the time had thought it should be preserved. 2 men in front of a Harley-Davidson Softail in the parking area of the Industrial Way garage. Afternoon light, the long shadows of late summer, the kind of day that smells like hot pavement and cold beer, and the particular freedom of having no obligations until after dark. The man on the left was younger, leaner, with a full dark beard and a prospect patch on his cut that he wore with the pride of someone still in the process of earning something. He was grinning. A real grin, unperformed and genuine, the kind that reaches the eyes because it does not need to present anything to anyone. The man on the right was Calhoun, 15 years younger, and he was also grinning, which was a thing that people who knew him now and had not known him then would have found implausible. Gary Merritt. Calhoun looked at the photograph from his position at the table, not getting up to examine it more closely, just looking at it across the room. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked back at the coin. The thing about Gary that had made the eventual betrayal land with the specific weight it had carried was that Gary had been genuinely difficult to dislike. Not difficult in the way of an irritating person whose redeeming qualities you work to locate, but difficult in the more fundamental way of someone whose company made you feel that the moment you were in was worth being in. Gary Merritt had cared about engines the way certain men care about music or mathematics, with a devotion that had the quality of vocation rather than preference, and that kind of authentic commitment had a contagious quality that drew people to it. He had spent 18 months in the orbit of the Spokane Charter, and in that time he had rebuilt 4 motorcycles from strip frames, had diagnosed a recurring electrical fault in the chapter's truck that 3 other mechanics had missed, and had become through the accumulation of reliable performance rather than any deliberate campaign. Someone the older members trusted. That was the specific thing the betrayal had cost. Not the $9,000, which was not irrelevant, but was not the core of it. The core of it was the version of Gary Merritt that Calhoun and others had believed in, the version that turned out to be something other than what it had appeared to be. When trust is broken by someone who seemed trustworthy, the loss is not simply the thing that was taken. The loss also includes the accuracy of your own judgment, your confidence in your ability to read people. That was the wound that had stayed inflamed longest. And then Gary had taken the bike into the storm, and the highway patrol had called, and that had been the end of the available accounting. Calhoun pushed back from the table. He stood up, the movement deliberate in the way that large men's movements are deliberate when they are thinking about something else. He crossed the room to the wall of photographs and stood in front of the one with Gary. He looked at it up close, at the grin, at the prospect patch, at the summer light falling on both their faces, at the particular quality of the afternoon that the image had managed to preserve. Slab watched him from the table. Nobody else spoke. It was Decker Haynes who spoke from his position near the bar, where he had been for the past several minutes with his hands wrapped around a bottle he had not been drinking from. He was 24 years old, 11 months into his prospect period, the kind of young man who was quiet in the way that comes from paying attention rather than from having nothing to say. He said it without aggression, without the posture of challenge, in the even voice of someone who has decided they are willing to say a thing and is saying it. He said that the kid had nothing to do with any of it. The quality of the quiet in the room changed. Several men shifted without quite moving. Calhoun did not turn around. He kept his eyes on the photograph. Decker continued in the same quiet, even voice, not raising it, not pressing harder, simply extending the thought. He said the boy was 16 years old and he was dying in a hospital 4 miles from where they were all sitting. He said the boy had never done anything to anyone in this room. He said whatever debt Gary Merritt had owed had been settled by the manner of Gary Merritt's dying, and that what remained after that belonged to history and not to a 16-year-old kid who had been 4 years old when any of it happened. Slab turned his head and looked at Decker with a long, measuring look, the look of a man going through several possible responses and selecting carefully. Calhoun turned around. He looked at Decker with those pale eyes from across the room. Decker held the look with the steadiness of someone who has decided to hold it, regardless of what it costs, the specific courage of a young man who has identified the right thing to say and has said it and is now prepared to bear the consequences. Calhoun said nothing. He looked at Decker for long enough that the silence had weight. Then he walked back to the table and sat down and placed the coin in front of him and closed his hand around it. He sat there with his fist closed and the fire in the stove throwing its uneven light and the rain loud on the warehouse roof. Then he reached to the drawer built into the underside of the oak table, the deep one on the left, the one that functioned as the private repository of his presidency, the place where things went that did not belong in public view. He moved aside folded documents and a leather notebook and a collection of accumulated small items and found what he was looking for near the back left corner. He set it on the table beside the coin. It was a photograph. Smaller than the one on the wall, the corner slightly bent, printed on the thinner paper of a snapshot. The same garage, the same motorcycle, the same summer light falling at the same late afternoon angle. 2 men. But in this one, Gary Merritt was not grinning. He was looking directly at the camera with an expression that was quieter and more serious than any Calhoun had seen on his face during the 18 months of his life as a chapter prospect. And Gary had his arm around Calhoun's shoulders, not posed, not arranged the natural and unconscious drape of someone who does not need to calculate whether they are welcome in a space. Calhoun had taken this photograph out of the frame on the wall the morning after Gary's death. He had not looked at it since. He looked at it now. Slab had moved at some point during the previous minutes and was now standing close enough to see the photograph without being asked to. He stood there for a moment reading the image and what it meant to find it here in this drawer kept this way. Then he pulled out the chair to Calhoun's left and sat down in it, which was not something he did at the oak table without specific invitation, and rested his forearms on the wood. He said there was something Calhoun should know, something that several of the senior members had known for a long time and had not said in a formal context because the moment for saying it had never clearly presented itself. He said it now because the moment had apparently arrived. He said that on the night Gary Merritt took the club bike and drove into the storm, There had been a window of approximately 40 minutes between Gary's departure from the garage and the highway patrol call. In that window, the club had received a communication through the sensitive contact line, a channel whose access was restricted to members and prospects in standing. The communication had identified a staging location on the east side of Spokane where a rival organization had positioned vehicles and personnel for an operation that night targeting the chapter's leadership. 3 Spokane charter officers had been scheduled to attend a meeting at a location the rival group had learned about and intended to use. The communication had been specific and accurate and had arrived with enough lead time to redirect all 3 officers before the rival group moved. Nobody had died that night. Nobody had been hurt. The rival operation had found an empty location and withdrawn. The communication had been anonymous in the sense that the protocol made tracing it impossible by design. But the number of people with access to that channel was small and finite, and after Gary's death, after the complete accounting of everything, Slab and 2 other senior members had arrived at the only conclusion the evidence supported. Gary Merritt, on the night he stole the bike and ran, had first picked up a phone. He had used the last calm minutes available to him to pass along information that redirected 3 men away from a place they would have been hurt or killed. He had stolen from the chapter for 14 months. And in the last hour of his life, before he drove the bike into the storm and off the highway, he had given something back that could not be measured in the same currency as the theft. Both of those things were true simultaneously. They had always been true. They had simply never been said in the same room at the same time until this moment. Calhoun sat with this for a long time. The stove shifted. The rain kept coming. The fire threw its uneven orange light across the walls and the ceiling, and the photographs of faces, some of which were still alive, because of a phone call made by a man who had been a thief and who had, in the last hour of his life, made one different choice. He looked at the coin. He looked at the photograph of Gary's quiet, serious face with its arm around the shoulder of the man he had eventually robbed. He looked at Slab, who had known this for 12 years and had chosen tonight to say it, which was itself a kind of answer to a question that had not been explicitly asked. There was nothing to say that would be proportionate to what Slab had just placed on the table alongside the coin and the photograph. So Calhoun said nothing for a while. He sat with the full weight of it and let it be what it was. Then he thought about Eli Dawson, 16 years old, 74 pounds, a boy who had carried a dead man's coin under his pillow for 3 weeks because it was the only physical connection he had to a father he had never been able to see clearly. A boy who had refused a governor and concert tickets and celebrity meetings and asked instead for truth and the sound of engines and some accounting of what his blood was actually worth. A boy who was 4 miles west of here, running out of hours in a hospital room, spending them in the specific sustained terror of someone who is about to leave the world and is afraid of what they are leaving behind them. The truth about Gary Merritt was not simple. It had never been simple. A man who steals is a thief, full stop. A man who on the night of his own desperate flight turns back and gives information that saves lives. That man is something else as well. Something that does not cancel the theft, but exists alongside it in the permanent and unresolvable complexity of an actual human life. The accounting does not simplify. It never does. The most Calhoun had ever been able to say about any man was that he had done some things right and some things wrong, and that the ratio varied case by case, and that on at least one occasion Gary Merritt had done the right thing when it cost him everything he had left to give. That was something. It was not nothing. For a 16-year-old boy who had been carrying the fear of nothing for 12 years, it was possibly enough. Calhoun stood up. He put the snapshot back in the drawer and closed it. He picked up the coin and held it in his palm with the skull looking up at him from the center of his hand. He put it in his breast pocket. He walked to the door of the warehouse and pulled it open and stood in the opening with the rain falling straight down into the gravel lot in front of him and the smell of wet asphalt and cold air, and the particular smell of the storm coming off the hills to the west. He stood there long enough that the men at the table in the bar straightened without being instructed to. Then he turned around and looked at Slab. He said, "Get on the radio." He said, "Every charter within 200 miles. He said they were riding tonight. Nobody asked why. Nobody asked for a plan or an outcome or a justification. That was not how it worked here, and everyone in the room had known how it worked here for long enough that the question would have been an embarrassment to the man asking it. Slab already had the radio off his belt. The Seattle charter frequency went active within 4 minutes. Portland acknowledged within 7. The Nomad relay broadcast went out across 3 states within 12 minutes, a chain of brief, stripped-down transmissions moving through the dark and the rain the way current moves through wire, carrying exactly the information required and nothing additional. The message was simple. Calhoun was riding to Hargrove Medical Center in Spokane. Any brother within range who wanted to be there should get on his bike. In a house on the north side of Seattle, a man who had been asleep since 9 o'clock put on his cut before he fully remembered the act of waking up the training of years, making the sequence automatic. In a garage outside Portland, 3 men who had spent the evening working on a transmission rebuild covered the project with a tarp, ran their bikes out of the garage and into the rain, and pulled onto the highway heading northeast without a conversation about it. In a motel parking lot outside Moses Lake, a Nomad rider who had stopped for the night and was eating a sandwich in the cab of his truck finished the sandwich, started his bike, and pulled out onto the dark highway heading east. None of them knew the specifics. None of them needed to. Calhoun was riding to a hospital in the middle of the night in a rainstorm for a reason that mattered. That was the complete extent of the information required. The rest was implicit in the act of getting on the bike. Back inside the warehouse, Decker Haynes was working his jacket on when Slab crossed the room and came to stand beside him. Slab was not a man who spoke in elaborate constructions. He stood next to Decker for a moment with the specific quality of presence that communicates something precisely because it does not try to communicate it through words. Then he said simply that Decker had said the right thing. He said it once flat and direct, and then moved on toward the door, and Decker stood with his jacket half on, and something resolving itself in his face that he completed by finishing with the jacket and following. The bikes came out from under the awning. One by one, engines started in the rain, the individual sounds building toward the collective before the group formed up in the lot. Calhoun's Midnight Blue Softail was first out of the row. He started it and sat while it warmed the single-engine note steady in the wet air, and then he pulled forward to the gate and waited. By the time Slab had the gate open and the first wave of bikes was lined up behind Calhoun, the rain had intensified, coming down in the heavy-driven way of a storm that has committed itself. The headlights of the lined-up bikes cut through the rain in parallel lines pointing west toward the hospital. Calhoun checked his mirrors. The line behind him extended back into the dark beyond where the lot lights reached. He put the bike in gear and rode. At Hargrove Medical Center, 4 miles west, the oncology ward had settled into its nighttime configuration. The corridor lighting was dimmed to its nighttime level, a softer, warmer light than the fluorescence of the day shift. The nurses' station was staffed at reduced capacity, 2 nurses instead of 4, the pace of the ward measured and quiet. The medical equipment in the patient rooms kept its patient count, the numbers and waveforms on the monitors changing in small, continuous increments that only meant something to people trained to read them. In room 412, Eli Dawson was not sleeping. Nurse Doyle had adjusted his position earlier, propping him slightly higher on the pillow to ease the fluid pressure on his lungs, and the change had helped a little, made the breathing fractionally less labored. The morphine moved through him in its slow, heavy wave, making the room soft at its edges and slowing the rate at which things arrived at him. But he was present in it. His mind was still operating inside the gauze and distance of the drug, thinking its own thoughts on its own terms. He was thinking about the fragment, the one that was not quite a memory, or possibly was exactly a memory, and he had never been willing to fully claim it as one, because the claiming of it raised questions he had not been ready to answer. The smooth warmth of the gas tank beneath him, the specific grip of small hands on chrome, his own hands the size and proportion of a child of 3 or 4. The vibration that came up through the metal and through him and filled his chest with a frequency that was not alarming, but was the opposite of alarming, the specific comfort of an enormous force that is on your side. The arms coming around him from behind, steady and sure, tattooed in patterns he could never quite bring into focus when he tried to look at them in the fragment's soft interior light. He had never been able to turn around in the fragment to see the face. Every time he tried to turn, the image dissolved, returning him to his pillow, to the hospital room, to the present. He had attempted over the years to construct the face from the available materials, to build it up from photographs and the few things his mother had told him without being asked. But constructed faces don't feel like memory. They feel like what they are. He turned his head on the pillow. Diane was in the chair beside him, her head tipped back slightly, her eyes not fully closed but not fully open, either occupying the suspended half-present state she inhabited for most of each night available, but not awake. Her face in the dimmed light had the quality of exhaustion that goes all the way down, visible in the bones of it as much as the surface. He said her name softly. She was present immediately, completely, the specific wakefulness of a parent in a hospital that has nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with attention. He asked her to tell him something about Gary. Not about the accident, he said. Not anything about what happened. Just something she remembered that was real. Diane looked at her son's face for a moment. She settled back in the chair and looked toward the rain-covered window, at the dark glass and the city lights behind it, and she was quiet for a few seconds, choosing. She told him about a Sunday in late spring the year before Gary died. Eli had been 3 years old, and they had driven out to a place on the Little Spokane River that Gary had discovered while doing some road work in that area, a flat gravel bar where the river ran shallow and clear over smooth round stones. She said the path from the road to the river bar had been muddy from recent rain, and Eli's boots were too small, and Gary had put Eli on his shoulders for the last quarter mile, carrying him with the easy confidence of a man for whom the weight was nothing. She said that when they got to the river bar, Eli had wanted to know whether the stones on the bottom looked the same color underwater as they did in the air, and Gary had waded into the river in his jeans and boots, the cold water coming up past his knees, and stood there in the shallows, while Eli crouched at the very edge of the bank and stared down at the stones with the focused intensity of a scientist. She said Gary had stood there with cold river water filling his boots for at least 10 minutes, while Eli conducted his examination, and that he had looked over at her on the bank with an expression she had never been able to fully describe. She said it was something between disbelief and gratitude, like a man who cannot quite believe the specific shape his life has taken and is trying to look directly at it before the light changes. She stopped. She looked at her hands in her lap. Eli was quiet for a moment. Then he asked her in the careful voice of someone approaching the question they actually wanted to ask, whether Gary had loved him. Diane looked at her son. She looked at him directly, without searching for words or qualifying language, with the steadiness of someone answering a question they know the answer to. She told him yes. She said it the way you say a thing you know is absolutely true, without decoration or hedge, because decoration and hedge are what you add to uncertain things. She said Gary Merritt had loved him with everything the man had, which was not everything a son deserves, and which had not been enough to make him into the person his son needed him to be. But it was real. It had been completely real. Eli closed his eyes. He lay still with whatever he was processing behind them, the large, slow work of a boy who is running out of time to resolve the large, slow questions. Nurse Doyle appeared in the doorway at some point, made her quiet round of the room, checked the IV and the morphine drip, and noted things on her chart, and paused on her way out. She looked at Diane. Diane gave her the small, exhausted nod that was their primary mode of exchange at this hour. The compressed communication of two people who have been in close proximity to the same thing for long enough to develop a private shorthand. 3 floors below, Gloria Wexler had come back to the building. She had gone home at 6 in the evening with the intention of sleeping, had lain awake for 2 hours in her street clothes, and had driven back at 10:30, which was not a thing she normally did, and which she attributed to professional responsibility without examining it too closely. She had positioned an additional security guard at the main lobby entrance. She had spoken with the overnight security supervisor and confirmed that the protocol for unauthorized access was clear and that the Spokane Police Department duty line was in the contact list on the main desk phone. She had made herself a cup of coffee in the administrative lounge and sat at the second floor administrative desk and worked through some documentation that needed attention. She had done all of this with the focused efficiency that was her primary professional tool. She was good at her job. Her job required anticipating problems and addressing them before they became liabilities. And the feeling she had been carrying since that morning's conversation in room 412 was the specific feeling of an anticipated problem that had not yet materialized but that she was not willing to declare resolved. She was on her second cup of coffee when the first indication reached her. It came in below the threshold of sound initially. A vibration in the building felt in the chair and the desk surface, rather than heard through the air, a low periodic disturbance, with the rhythm of something mechanical and repeated rather than random. She set down the coffee cup and sat still and paid attention to it. It was getting stronger. In room 412, the plastic cup of water on the bedside table had begun to show it on its surface. The water moved in faint rhythmic rings, small circles expanding from the center and reaching the rim and folding back, continuous and increasing. The kind of movement that requires a sustained source, not a passing truck or a gust of wind, but something that was both persistent and approaching. Diane was not watching the cup. She was watching her son. But Eli's eyes had opened. He was watching the cup with the focused attention of someone who has detected something and is verifying it before acting on it. He turned his head toward the window, toward the dark glass and the rain and the city lights behind it. He lay still for a long moment, listening with his entire body in the way that very young children and very sick people listen when the ordinary filtering mechanisms are reduced and everything comes in directly. He turned his head back to his mother. He said her name, and his voice had something in it that had not been present in it for weeks. Not strength, which was past recovering. Something else. Something that lived in the neighborhood of wonder. He said that the ground was shaking. Diane looked at the cup. The rings on the water surface were continuous and growing. She stood up from the chair and crossed the room and pressed her hand flat against the cold glass of the window and felt the glass humming against her palm, a mechanical frequency working up through the building's foundation from somewhere outside and below, rhythmic and growing in strength, with the steady, unstoppable accumulation of many engines moving together over a long distance toward a fixed point. She looked down through the rain-covered glass at the streets and the parking areas below. The lights came first, a river of them, white and amber, approaching from the east along the main access road. They filled the road from edge to edge and stretched back into the darkness, far beyond where the road lights failed, hundreds of individual lights, moving in a formation with the unhurried, certain quality of something that has already decided its destination and sees no reason to accelerate toward it. The sound arrived a moment later, rolling up the face of the building from below in a layered compound wave. The individual voices of dozens and then hundreds of large displacement engines combining into a single frequency that was not quite sound in the ordinary sense, but something closer to a condition of the environment. A change in the pressure and quality of the air itself felt in the sternum and behind the eyes and deep in the chest. The cup on the bedside table was vibrating continuously. The water in it moved in constant rings. Down the corridor, the nurse's station erupted into sudden confused activity. Car alarms in the lower parking structure were triggering in a cascade triggered by the vibration, their electronic screams cutting over and through the engine roar in a chaotic layer of sound. A resident physician who had been in the on-call room appeared in the hallway in his scrubs with the confused, alarmed expression of someone woken by something they cannot categorize. Two nurses were at the end of corridor window with their hands against the glass. Gloria Wexler had made it to the fourth-floor corridor window by some route that she could not entirely account for afterward, and she was looking down at the front of the building with her clipboard somewhere behind her, and both hands on the window frame, and the coffee she had been carrying was on the floor where she had apparently set it down without looking. The motorcycles came up the access road and did not stop at the curb. They rolled onto the front lawn and into the ambulance bay, and across the entrance plaza, filling every available surface with chrome and leather and engine sound, the continuous earth-shaking declaration of their presence. the sound so large now that it had ceased to be something you heard and had become instead something you inhabited, a condition of the air that surrounded the building on all sides and came through the walls and the glass and the concrete and existed equally in every room. Gloria was already reaching for her phone. In room 412, Eli had turned his head toward the window and lay watching the light move on the ceiling above him. The reflection of 300 headlights scattered upward through rain and glass and painted across the white hospital ceiling in shifting, continuous amber and white. His eyes were open and clear and very bright. He looked at his mother. She was still standing at the window with her hand against the glass, and tears were running down her face in two straight lines, and she was not making any effort to stop them or address them or manage them in any way. He asked her if she could hear them. She turned from the window. She looked at her son, this boy who was 16 years old and 74 pounds, and had carried a coin under his pillow for 3 weeks and spent his dying wish on truth and engines and the possibility that his blood was worth something. She looked at him for a moment before answering. She told him yes. She told him she could hear them. She told him they came. The lobby of Hargrove Medical Center received them as a space received something for which it was not designed, absorbing the impact without being able to manage it. The automatic sliding doors at the main entrance hissed apart, and a wall of cold air and exhaust smell and the raw hot scent of metal and engine oil came through them like a displacement event, like something with actual mass arriving at speed. And the two security guards posted at the reception desk stepped forward exactly one step and then stopped and stood with the particular stillness of people who have reassessed a situation mid-motion. Raymond Calhoun walked through the doors first. He was wet from the ride, his gray beard pressed flat by the rain. His leather cut darkened across the shoulders and chest where the water had soaked in. He walked with the economy and certainty of someone who has spent enough decades making rooms adjust to him that the adjustment is now automatic, no longer requiring his attention. Behind him came Slab Tanner and 8 senior officers of the Spokane Charter, all of them large, all of them wet, all of them carrying the specific quiet of men who are not making a display of their presence, but cannot help occupying more of any space than is comfortable for the people already in it. Behind them, through the glass doors and across the plaza, and filling the access road back into the darkness where the streetlights failed, 300 motorcycles sat idling in the rain. The sound of them did not diminish with the doors closed. It moved through the glass and the walls and the concrete foundations of the building, a continuous low vibration that made the reception desk surface tremble and the light fitting above the waiting area sway in a small, slow arc. The two security guards looked at the men in front of them. They looked at each other. The one on the right had his hand near the radio on his belt. He made no move to pick it up. Calhoun looked at them both and did not stop walking. The elevator at the far end of the lobby opened and Gloria Wexler came out of it, moving at a pace she did not normally use, crossing the lobby floor with her clipboard in both hands, and her face arranged in the expression of someone who is prepared for this confrontation and is committed to it. She placed herself in the center of the lobby, directly in Calhoun's path, and said stop with the full weight of her position and her title and her 23 years of managing this institution. Calhoun stopped. He looked at her. He registered her size relative to his, the clipboard held in front of her chest, the genuine fear visible beneath the authority she was projecting, and the fact that she was not moving from where she had placed herself. He registered all of these things without expression. He reached into the inner pocket of his cut and removed a folded collection of $100 bills and walked the remaining distance to the reception desk and set it on the surface with the flat, definitive sound of something being placed permanently. He told the woman behind the desk that was for whatever they tracked onto the floors. He looked back at Gloria. He told her she could call the mayor. He told her she could call whoever she believed was appropriate to call. He said he did not particularly care about the call list. He said that if she placed herself between him and the stairwell door one more time, he would ask Slab to move her, and he said it with the precise, even calm of a man who was describing the expected sequence of events rather than issuing a threat. Gloria took one step to the side. It was a precise, limited movement, the adjustment of a woman who has correctly assessed the gap between the authority she holds and the situation in front of her and is not pretending the gap doesn't exist. She was already dialing as she stepped aside, her phone in the hand not holding the clipboard. She would keep dialing. She would not stop doing her job. But she moved. Calhoun walked to the emergency stairwell door and pushed it open. The 9 men followed him in. The door closed behind them. Their footsteps on the concrete stairs filled the shaft, a heavy rhythmic drumbeat, ascending floor by floor toward the fourth. In the lobby, the overnight security supervisor had his radio out. The guards at the reception desk had not moved. The woman behind the desk was looking at the folded bills with an expression that suggested she was uncertain which category of event this fell under. Outside in the rain, 300 men sat on their idling bikes. They were not on their phones. They were not talking among themselves in the way people talk when they are waiting. They were simply their engines running, the collective presence of them, enormous and patient, and specific, a declaration made in the language that had always come most naturally to them. In the stairwell, Calhoun climbed in silence. Slab was at his right shoulder. At the second-floor landing, he paused for a single breath. Not from physical effort, from something else, something that happened in the chest rather than the lungs, an acknowledgement of the particular weight of what was above him and what he was going up to do. Then he continued. At the fourth floor, he pushed open the fire door. The pediatric oncology ward at 1:30 in the morning was enforced quiet and careful light, and the soft, persistent sounds of machines doing the work of keeping track. The corridor was wide and clean. The nurses' station at its center, staffed at night levels, the monitors at the station showing the condition of every patient on the floor and the small glowing numbers that meant nothing without the training to read them. The nurses had heard the boots on the stairs. They had also been watching the front plaza from the end of corridor window for the previous 10 minutes, tracking the lights and the sound with the particular attention of people who have understood that something large and unprecedented is in process. When the fire door opened and 9 men in leather walked onto their ward, the response was not panic. It was the stillness of people who have been bracing for something and have now received it and are discovering that it is something they can stand. 2 nurses pressed themselves against the wall beside the station with the automatic, non-panicked response of people creating space. A third stood at the desk with the composed authority of someone who has decided that her patients are the fixed point and everything else is variable. Dr. Pratt stepped out of a supply room doorway. He had been there for several minutes since he had checked Eli's IV at 1:15 and stood at the room's window afterward, watching the headlights come up the access road and then come into the lot and onto the lawn. He had stood there thinking about several things. Then he had come into the corridor to wait. He looked at Calhoun with the direct professional assessment of a man whose training is in reading situations accurately and quickly and making decisions based on what he finds rather than what he wishes were true. He looked at Calhoun's face. He looked at the coin visible at the edge of the breast pocket of the cut, the tarnished silver catching the corridor light. He stepped aside. He pointed to the door at the end of the corridor on the left. Calhoun walked the length of the corridor. The other 8 men spread along the wall outside the room, creating without instruction or arrangement the kind of presence that stands guard without being asked to. Slab took the position at the doorframe and gave Calhoun a single nod. Calhoun put his hand on the door and went in. The room received him. It was small, the way hospital rooms are small, the dimensions further reduced by the equipment filling it, the monitors and IV stands, and the adjustable mechanical bed with its rails and its thin white mattress on which Eli Dawson lay under the thin white sheet and the small blue blanket from home that had been on this bed for 11 months. Diane was on her feet. She had been at the window and had turned when the door opened, and she was standing between the bed and the door with her arms slightly away from her sides, in the stance of someone who is not sure whether to advance or retreat and has decided to hold the ground they are on. She looked at Calhoun. She did not speak. Calhoun stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the boy in the bed. Eli was awake. The morphine had done what it could to soften the room, reduce the sharpness of it, but it had not taken him under. He was present behind his eyes in the way Calhoun recognized from men he had sat with in hard places and hard hours, the specific quality of attention that comes to people who know with certainty that they are running out of time and have decided to use what remains to be completely present in it. Eli looked at Calhoun. He took in the size of him, the leather cut, the scars on his jaw and brow, the gray beard, the pale eyes. He looked at him with the expression of a person who has been carrying an image of someone in their mind for a long time and is now comparing the image to the reality and finding the reality more real. Calhoun crossed the room. He pulled the chair from against the wall and placed it close to the bed and sat in it. And for a moment, the room contained them both in a particular kind of quiet. The man and the boy, the monitors and the oxygen line, and coming through the window glass from 4 floors below, the engines reduced by distance and walls to a deep, continuous, felt as much as heard vibration. That was the sound of 300 people keeping a promise. Calhoun reached into his breast pocket and brought out the coin. He held it so Eli could see it, the skull with its spread wings tarnished to pewter in the hospital light. He turned it once between his fingers. Then he leaned forward and placed it in Eli's hand, closing the boy's thin fingers around it with both of his own large hands for a moment before releasing. Eli looked at the coin in his fist. He looked up at Calhoun. Calhoun told him that his mother had come to see him. He said she had driven across town in a rainstorm and walked up to a locked gate and stood in the rain and asked for something, and that the kind of person who does that for someone else is the kind of person you do not deserve to let down. Eli's eyes moved to Diane. She was still standing between the bed and the door, and something in her face had shifted some of the bracing coming out of it. Calhoun looked at the boy. He said he had something to tell him about his father. The engines outside were a constant presence at the edge of the room's sound, a low undertone that was less something you heard than something you rested on, like the sound of the earth itself at some fundamental and sustaining frequency. Calhoun said that Gary Merritt was not a saint. He said there were no saints in his world, and he had stopped expecting any long before Gary arrived in it. He said Gary had made serious mistakes, the kind that cost people, the kind that break trust in ways that cannot be fully repaired. He said he was not going to tell Eli otherwise, because Eli was 16 years old and had earned the right to be addressed as someone who can hold a complicated truth. Eli held his gaze and did not look away. Calhoun said, but he let the words sit for a moment, giving it the full weight it carried. He said that on the night Gary Merritt died, before he got on the motorcycle, Gary made a phone call. He said the call contained specific information about a threat, information that Gary should not have been in possession of, and that nobody else would have passed along information that redirected 3 men away from a location where they would have been seriously hurt or killed. He said he did not know what Gary was thinking in the last calm minutes before he drove into the storm. He could not tell Eli whether it was conscience or some surviving loyalty or the specific love of a father who understood he was out of time and wanted to use what remained of it well. He could not say. What he could say was that 4 men were alive because of that choice, and that he had known this for 12 years and had not said it out loud until tonight. He said that was the man he chose to remember. Not the whole of Gary Merritt, not a man without fault, not a hero in the simple and uncomplicated sense. A man who had gotten most of it wrong and had in the last hour of his life gotten one thing right. He said in his experience that was more than some men ever managed. Eli had not moved during any of this. He lay against his pillow with the coin pressed in his closed fist against his sternum, and his eyes were very bright in the dim light, and he was crying in the quiet and undefended way of someone who has stopped managing how they appear because there is no longer any reason to. The tears ran from the corners of his eyes into the pillow, and he did not move to wipe them. He said, his voice barely audible over the oxygen line, that his dad had saved people. Calhoun said yes. He said Gary Merritt had saved lives, and it had cost him everything he had remaining when he chose to do it, and that was not a small thing. That was not nothing. That was the thing a man does when everything else has been stripped away and what is left underneath is what he actually is. Eli closed his eyes. He held the coin against his chest. His breathing was shallow and wet and labored the sound of lungs working against fluid, the sound that Dr. Pratt had been tracking all night with the careful attention of a man who knows what it is approaching. The monitors registered their slow and patient count. The engines continued below. Diane had moved at some point to the other side of the bed. She was sitting on the mattress edge beside her son, her hand on his arm, not speaking. Calhoun reached up and began to unbutton his leather cut. He did it slowly, each button deliberate the motion, having the quality of something ceremonial, not because it was being performed for anyone, but because it was the kind of thing that deserves the care you would give it if someone were watching. The cut was a Hell's Road MC President's vest, heavy black leather worn to a supple darkness, over 22 years of membership and 7 as chapter president. The death head on the back, the president patch on the front left chest, the MC and city rockers, a row of pins and smaller patches along the sides and collar that constituted the physical record of a life in an organization the way a soldier's medals constitute the physical record of their service. He slid it from his shoulders. Slab in the doorway saw what was happening. He went completely still. In the hallway behind him, the men along the wall went quiet in the particular way of people who are watching something they understand to be outside the ordinary events of their experience, something they will remember and that will mean something to them when they remember it. Calhoun stood up from the chair and leaned over the bed and laid the leather cut across Eli's chest. It was enormous on him, the weight of it compressing the mattress fractionally, the smell of it filling the room, leather and oil, and the specific smell of years of road of distance traveled. The patches caught the light. The death head spread its wings across the thin white sheet in the small blue blanket. He adjusted the collar so it lay flat. He made sure the president patch was positioned over the boy's heart. Then he sat back down and leaned his forearms on his knees and looked at Eli's face. He said, "Patched in." He said it with the weight it carried in his world, not as metaphor or honorary designation, but as the thing it actually was, a formal recognition, an acknowledgement made by the authority of his position that could not be taken back or amended or reviewed. He said Eli Dawson was patched into the Hell's Road MC as of this moment, and that this was not subject to the policy of any foundation or the authority of any hospital administrator or the jurisdiction of anyone outside this room. He said Eli rode with them. He said little brother, and the words came out of him in the low gravel-worn register of a voice that has said difficult things in difficult places over many years, and what they carried was not performance and was not ceremony and was simply true. Eli opened his eyes. He looked down at the leather cut spread across his chest. His hand came up trembling with the effort of the motion, and his fingers found the president patch over his heart. He traced the edge of it with one fingertip, the embroidered thread, the raised lettering. The expression on his face was not happiness in the uncomplicated sense. It was more complete than happiness. It was the expression of someone who has been carrying a heavy thing for a long time and has just been told they are allowed to set it down. He looked at Calhoun and said, "Thank you." 2 words, and they cost him the breath he had available for them, and he used it on them anyway. Calhoun nodded once. He unclipped the 2-way radio from his belt. He held it at his side for a moment, his thumb over the transmit button. He looked at the coin in Eli's fist. He looked at the monitors. He looked at Diane's hand on her son's arm. He looked at the face of the boy who had come 4 miles in 12 years, and all the distance between being 4 years old on a gas tank and being here to finally get the answer. He brought the radio to his mouth. He said, "Let him hear it." The transmission lasted less than 2 seconds. The response was immediate and total. What came through the walls and the floors and the glass and the 4 stories of concrete and steel above the parking plaza was not a sound in the ordinary sense. It was 300 Harley-Davidson engines opening their throttles at the same moment in a sustained, full-throated, coordinated roar that had no parallel in the experience of anyone inside that building. Each engine contributed its own distinct voice to the collective frequency, the sum of them something beyond addition, a single enormous sound that was simultaneously many sounds that changed the quality of the air itself, that was felt in the bones of the building and in the bones of the people inside it. The windows shook in their frames. The monitors flickered once and recovered. The IV stands trembled against the floor. The cup on the bedside table crossed 2 inches of surface and stopped at the edge. The light fixtures overhead moved in their slow, small arc. In the corridor, the nurses stood without speaking and listened with the specific listening of people receiving something that they did not expect and cannot categorize and will carry with them. Dr. Pratt, positioned near the door of room 412, had placed one hand flat against the wall and was holding it there, feeling the building's vibration against his palm, and his face was doing something private and complicated that he did not try to manage. Gloria Wexler, 4 floors below in the lobby, had stopped moving. She was standing in the center of the lobby floor with her phone in her hand and the call she had been about to make still not made. And she was listening to the sound come through the floor and the walls, and she was not saying anything, and the clipboard was somewhere she could not immediately account for. Sergeant Corbett Fales of the Spokane Police Department was standing on the front entrance plaza in the rain with 4 officers behind him, the ones who had responded to the emergency call. He had recognized Calhoun's midnight blue Softail in the front row when he pulled into the lot, the custom bike he had encountered parked at several locations over 15 years in circumstances that had consistently not required his active response, a feature of the city's actual functioning that he had integrated into his professional understanding long ago. He had stood in the rain and looked at the bikes and the men on them, and the rain falling over all of it, and the hospital building with the one lit window on the 4th floor. He had turned to the security supervisor who had come out to meet him and had told him in clear, simple language that he did not see a threat on this property. He said he saw a gathering of citizens on private property with what appeared to be the acquiescence of the property owner, and he had nodded toward the folded bills visible on the reception desk through the glass doors. He said that unless someone inside was being actively harmed, his officers were going to stand by and ensure public safety on the access road. The security supervisor had started to respond. Fales had put his hat back on and walked to the edge of the plaza and stood there facing outward in the rain, and that had been that. Now the engines roared, and Fales stood in the rain with his hat brim shedding water and kept his eyes on the access road and did not turn to look at the building behind him. His officers did the same. 2 of them had drifted almost without appearing to positions where they could see the lit window on the 4th floor. Inside room 412, the sound was complete. It filled every available space in the room, pressing outward against the walls, vibrating in the glass, in the metal of the bed frame, in the IV stands, in the monitoring equipment. It vibrated in the thin bones of a 16-year-old boy lying under a leather cut that was too large for him in every way except the single way that mattered. It was the sound Eli had been trying to recover from the fragment of memory for 12 years. The felt sense of enormous power and the vibration that goes through small hands gripping chrome and through a small body on a gas tank and into the chest where it lives alongside everything else a person carries until the carrying is done. He had it now, complete and real and surrounding him, exactly as he had known it and never quite been able to hold. His eyes were closed. The coin was in his fist. The leather covered him. His mother's hand was on his arm. His breathing was shallow and wet and slow, the sound of it audible beneath the roar outside, and his face was still, and on it was the specific quality of peace that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from the resolution of a question that has been asking itself for a very long time. Calhoun sat in the chair with his forearms on his knees and his hands loose between them, and watched the boy's face and did not speak and did not move. Diane watched her son. The monitors kept their count. The engines roared. The rain fell on Spokane without distinction on the hospital and the warehouse and the highway where Gary Merritt had died, and the gravel bar on the Little Spokane River, where a 3-year-old boy had once crouched at the water's edge in the late afternoon light, studying whether stones change color underwater. The continuous tone began at 1:47 in the morning. It was a single, sustained, unwavering note from the heart monitor, the sound that carries exactly one piece of information and carries it completely. It filled the room and was immediately surrounded by the engine roar outside, so that the 2 sounds existed in the same moment, the flat line and the 300 throttles, the ending and the enormous declaration around it layered in a way that was neither peaceful nor wrong, but simply real. The way difficult, true things are real. Diane did not make a sound. She brought her son's hand to her face, both hands around his, the coin pressing into her palm between them, and she held it there and stayed very still. Calhoun sat with them. He remained in the chair with his hands loose and his eyes on the still face of the boy under the leather cut, and he stayed while Dr. Pratt came through the door and moved through the room with the quiet, necessary efficiency of his profession, confirming what was already confirmed, noting the time adjusting things that needed adjusting. He stayed after Pratt left. He stayed while Nurse Doyle came in and stood near the door for a few minutes and then went quietly out. He stayed while the monitors were silenced at Diane's request, and the room became quiet in a different way, a settled quiet rather than a waiting one. At some point, Diane began to shake the deep, involuntary shaking of a person whose containment has reached its structural limit, the shaking that has nothing to do with cold and everything to do with what has been held for too long. Calhoun stood and moved around the bed and put his arm around her shoulders and held her in the straightforward, practical way you hold something that needs to stay upright while it resolves what it needs to resolve. He was not gentle in any performed sense. He was simply present and solid and there, which was what the situation required. He did not say it would be all right. He had been through enough hard hours to know better than to say that. When he finally spoke, it was close to her ear and the voice stripped of everything except the plain weight of what he was saying. He said Eli rode out brave. He said the debt was settled. Outside, the engines ran on. Then they began to stop one by one, and in small clusters, the way a fire subsides, the collective sound diminishing in layers as the men on the plaza and the lawn and the access road let their bikes go quiet. Some of them had ridden 200 miles through a storm in the middle of the night. Not one of them left before the last engine stopped. When it did, the silence was enormous. The particular silence of a space that has just been vacated by something very large. And in it, the rain was clean and audible again, falling without purpose on the pavement, in the lawn, in the parked cars, in the access road, and everything else in its reach. In room 412, Dr. Pratt had noted the time and gone to the corridor. The monitors were silent. The room was quiet with the settled quiet of a place where something is finished. The leather cut was still on Eli's chest. The coin was still in his hand. Diane sat beside him with her hands over his and her head bowed, and the morning was still hours away. Calhoun stayed until nearly 3. He sat in the chair and was present in the room, which was the only thing he had to offer, and which was in the arithmetic of hard hours, not a small thing. When he finally stood to go, he looked at Eli one last time. The leather cut spread across the thin chest, the tarnished coin in the closed fist, the face that had stopped being afraid. He picked up his radio from the bedside table. He looked at Diane. He told her the cut stayed with Eli. He said it was Eli's to keep, that it had been given and could not be taken back, and that she should not allow anyone to remove it. Diane looked up at him. Her face had been reduced by the night to what it actually was, and it was still beautiful in the specific way of things that have been completely and honestly present in difficult circumstances. She said, "Thank you," in a voice containing nothing but the meaning of those words. Calhoun nodded. He put on his jacket over the flannel shirt and walked out of room 412, down the corridor, through the fire door, down 4 flights of stairs through the lobby, where the bills were still on the reception desk and the security guards were still at their posts, and Gloria Wexler was sitting in a chair against the far wall with her clipboard on her knees and her eyes on the floor. He walked through the automatic doors and out into the rain. His bike was in the front row on the lawn where he had left it. The chrome was dull in the ambient light, the seat wet. He stood beside it with his hand on the handlebar and the rain falling on him. He stood there for a while without moving. Then he got on and started the engine and sat while it warmed, the single note of it rising into the empty, wet air of the plaza, the only engine sound left in a space that had held 300. He sat there a while longer. Then he rode. Gloria Wexler filed no incident report that night. The space on the form where she would have described the nature of the unauthorized access stayed blank. She left it that way. She did not discuss her reasons with anyone. 1 year later, on a Tuesday in October, Diane Dawson found an envelope in her mailbox. It carried a Spokane postmark and no return address. It was heavier than a standard envelope, slightly padded, the kind used for objects. She opened it at the kitchen table with her coffee. The morning light came through the window over the sink and moved across the table surface as the clouds shifted. Inside was a folded piece of heavy stock paper, the kind used for formal documents. She unfolded it and smoothed it against the table. At the top was the Hells Road MC Spokane Charter insignia, the death head with its spread wings printed in black on the white stock. Below it, in plain type text, a single line: Eli Dawson, patched in, Hells Road MC, riding always. Below the line were signatures. They covered both sides of the paper and continued onto a second sheet, and a third, signatures and road names and charter identifications from Spokane and Seattle and Portland and Boise and Missoula and a dozen other places. The ink was different colors, the handwriting different in every hand, some careful and deliberate and some fast and loose, some in pencil, some in thick black marker. 311 signatures in total. She counted them more than once on more than one occasion over the weeks that followed. Also in the envelope was a photograph. She had not seen it before. It was a printout from a security camera, still black and white, time-stamped 1:41 in the morning on the night Eli died. The camera angle was from the corridor outside room 412, the door slightly open, the interior in the room's nighttime light. In the frame visible through the gap of the door, a large man sat in a chair beside a hospital bed, with his forearms on his knees and his weight forward, and in the bed a small figure lay under something dark and heavy, spread across his chest. The large man's posture was the posture of a person who is completely, entirely present in a place and has no intention of being anywhere else. She looked at this photograph for a long time on the morning she found it. She looked at it on other mornings afterward. It held something that she could not fully articulate and did not try to. The last item in the envelope was a cashier's check. It was made out to Diane Dawson in the exact amount of every dollar that Hargrove Medical Center had billed and not collected across 14 months of treatment for Eli Dawson. Every dollar of it, paid in full. There was no note, no letter of explanation, no accounting of how the amount had been calculated or how the information had been obtained. At the very bottom of the envelope, loose against the padded inner lining, was the tarnished silver coin. She had not noticed it leave Eli's hand. She did not know how it had traveled from that room to wherever it had been for the past year. She picked it up and turned it over in her fingers. The skull with its spread wings, the worn textured edge, the letters of the charter name. On the back, in letters that had not been there before, freshly engraved with care into the soft surface of the metal, were 3 words: Debt settled, ride free. She sat at the kitchen table with the coin in her hand and the morning light moving across the table and the coffee cooling beside her, and she thought about her son for a long time. She thought about a boy who had been 16 years old and 74 pounds and had used his last wish on truth and engines and the possibility that his blood was worth something, and who had died with a coin in his fist and a leather president's cut across his chest, and 300 engines declaring something real and enormous into the October rain of a city that would not remember most of what happened that night, but would remember some of it in fragments, the way people remember things that do not fit into the ordinary categories of experience. She thought about Gary Merritt, who had been a thief and a man who ran, and a man who in the last hour of his running had turned back once. She thought about what it means to be someone's father, and what it means to fail at it, and what it means to leave behind in the world a boy who will carry the weight of your absence and your name and your unresolved story, and grow up anyway, and probably into someone who uses his dying wish not for himself, but for the truth about you. She thought about the way the cup on the bedside table had moved. Those first small rings on the surface of the water, barely visible, easily missed the first evidence that something large was coming from a long way away. She closed her hand around the coin. There are men who live their entire lives being exactly what the world believes them to be: dangerous, outside the arrangements that the rest of us depend on. We designate them. We build protocols to manage the risk they represent. We draw lines around them and stand on the other side of the lines and feel better for doing so. And then sometimes on a Tuesday night in October in the middle of a rainstorm, those men get on their bikes, all 300 of them, in the middle of the night, because a 16-year-old boy asked a question about his father and had only a few hours remaining in which to hear the answer. There is something in certain men, the ones who have lived hardest and by the least forgiving rules, something that does not appear on any federal registry or charter designation. It appears in other places, in the weight of a leather cut laid across a dying boy's chest, in the sound of 300 engines opening their throttles simultaneously in the dark, in a cashier's check sent without explanation, in a photograph sent without comment, in a coin returned with 3 words cut into its back by someone who understood that the accounting was finally complete. Not every man who looks like the most dangerous thing in the room is the worst thing in the room. Sometimes the most dangerous man you have ever seen is the one who shows up. Eli Dawson had known this. He had known it before he knew it in the way children carry knowledge in the body before the mind has the vocabulary for it. He had known it in the fragment of a memory he had carried since he was 4 years old, a memory of small hands on chrome and arms reaching around him from both sides, steady and sure, and there in the whole world reduced to vibration and forward motion and the absolute felt certainty of being held. He had carried that forward. That is the ride that does not end.